Okay, let's dive into Chapter 9, Communism, Communist and Post-Communist States. This video is going to be about the history and theory of communism. And then I'll be doing one that discusses the communism in practice, and then another one on the fall of communism, and then a final snippet on, is the juicy one, on how does Marx relate to current global struggles. Does Marxism have anything to say about the global struggles that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years? But that, as I said, that's a juicy one. But let's dive into the sort of the history and theory of communism. The first thing that I want to get across to you is that Marxism didn't spring out of nowhere. It wasn't just some crazy idea by Marx and his buddy Engels that came out of nowhere. It was intended, it was very much a part of and a function of both the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment in the sense that it was materialist. It's a big thing in Marxism. And as opposed to non-materialist, as opposed to spiritual or religious, temporal, that sort of thing. Looking for the solutions to problems on Earth using earthly reason, looking for natural solutions using the scientific method to find the truth. Marx considered himself a scientist who was, according to him, uncovering essential scientific truths about global capitalism and what would happen to it because of its, according to Marx, internal contradictions. Okay, more on that in a minute. The Industrial Revolution was an enormous change, obviously, right? And what that change led to in the time that Marx was writing in Europe, and largely in Germany and London, was enormous dislocation to everyday people, where sort of the average, stereotypical person goes from likely being a farmer to more or less being forced to move to a newly urbanized area to work in this new thing called a factory. Factories were new. Work had, for the vast majority of people throughout time, work had been done on farms. And it may have been coercive. Of course, it was coercive. It was hard, back-breaking work. But let's say in a feudal society, the peasant was the subject of the lord and had to pay taxes and do all this back-breaking work. But ultimately, that's quite a bit different than a factory condition. You're working normal daylight hours. You're working based on the seasons. You may have some freedom to, decide when you're going to work and how you're going to work and that sort of thing. There may be some fulfillment to like being responsible for growing food, right? You're not yet alienated from your work. That's a big thing for Marx. So people go from that lifestyle, which was quite tough, traditional, into this new thing where you live in a dirty, nasty, filthy city, probably without sewage, probably with a lot of disease, and probably in a tiny little apartment, and you have to go to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, no sick leave, none of that stuff. Maybe you have to buy stuff in the company store. You're still working physical labor. You're making peanuts, and you're alienated from your work, according to Marx. You're not. There's no emotional connection there to the work that you're doing because you're being forced to do it for peanuts by some owner who's making enormous profits off of you. Which brings us to our next key essential component of Marxism, and that is the concept of exploitation. And we all know what exploitation is. And for Marx, it was fairly specific. It's an economic term that he's using to describe the relationship of the labor to the work and the profits that come from his work, her work, right? So, what exactly does that mean? Here's a laptop, but more importantly, let's just talk about the laptop cover with this nice Vincent van Gogh Starry Night replica on it, okay? How much did it cost to make this laptop cover? And how much did it sell for? Let's say it cost $2.50 to make the laptop cover, and it sold for $12.50. $29.99. Let's say it sold for $29.99. So there's roughly $27 in profit. Okay. Exploitation for Marx is that the capitalist gets that profit. The surplus value of labor is that $27 for Marx is a product of the labor that was done to make it. That surplus value of labor for Marx should belong to the worker. It should not belong to the owner, to the capitalist. That's, of course, a controversial statement. You know, in under liberalism, the owner gets the profits because they're the entrepreneur that's taking the risk. They reach an agreed upon contract with the workers, right? Well, in the middle of the 1800s, those contracts weren't as agreed upon as we might think. There is a lot of force that's sometimes used in maintaining those contracts. Unions were brutally repressed by the state authorities. Not by sometimes by the capitalists, but sometimes by the state, by the police, by the National Army, that sort of thing, who are on the side, very clearly on the side of the owners, the capitalists, right? So Marx is seeing this. He sees that the labor no longer has any emotional connection to their work, and they don't have any, they're being exploited because the fruit of their work is being taken by someone else in the forms of profit. Okay, that's exploitation according to Marx. So, capitalism is starting out bad for Marx. He sees all this dislocation, he sees all this exploitation, and then he expands on existing theories of socialism and anarchism to create this new idea called communism. And in it, there will eventually be a utopia in which capitalism has been replaced by communism, in which the workers control the means of production, the factories and that sort of thing, the capital itself, the things that you use to create a product. The workers will control that. They'll make decisions that are for the good of themselves and everybody else, and then people will all be treated equally, and there won't be great inequality because there's no private property, that sort of thing. That's the rough idea behind communism. We'll talk about how it worked in practice in the next video snippet. But here's where it kind of gets interesting for Marx, is that he sees capitalism as being a system that is 100% inherently going to collapse. He sees it as a historical certainty that one day capitalism will cease to exist. Why? Marx says that there are contradictions built into capitalism. Okay? And at least one of these, in a very important way, he was dead wrong about. But he was a function of his times. He knew what he knew, and there were certain economic theories and understandings that had not yet been reached in Marx's time. And we'll talk about that in just a second. What he sees is really the biggest contradiction in capitalism is that as capitalists succeed, they will control more and more of the capital. And as that happens, the profit that they make on each individual item that they're selling is going to drop. It's going to diminish. This is an actual thing in economics. So in order to maintain growth, profit, they're going to have to get it from somewhere else. If they're making less and less profit per unit, they're going to have to get that profit for somewhere else. For Marx, the only place to get it is through the labor force. You have to. For Marx, labor will be continually squeezed. More and more will be taken from them. And as that happens and inequality grows, this will grow too much for the working class, the proletariat that are being put through this. They're being exploited more and more. And so they'll rise up and overthrow their capitalist overseers. Marx sees this as a certainty. He sees it as occurring in places that have already industrialized, which importantly does not apply to Russia. Here's what Marx missed. So all of that stuff is not bad. Here's what Marx mixed. He assumed that there would be no more great technological advances that would increase productivity. The increases in productivity for Marx would end. But what we've learned in the time since then is that productivity increases happen all the time. And they continually happen throughout that century and in the 20th century, and it's one reason why capitalism sort of becomes popular. People living in capitalist societies are relatively happy compared to people living in communist societies, not just because they're more free, that's a big part of it, but also because they're better off. There's a middle class that grows for a few decades in the 20th century globally in the capitalist countries. And meanwhile, the communist states are getting worse and worse off. And that's because we find new ways to increase productivity of the worker via technology, which Marx had no way to know was going to happen. And if he had known that, he might have reached different conclusions. So I'm going to leave the theory there for now on Marx. What happens next is Lenin comes along in Russia, and he's a communist. He's a follower of Marx, and he wants a revolution in his home country of Russia. But he is perfectly well aware that Russia is not an industrialized nation. They're playing catch up, and they're doing a pretty good job of industrializing, but they're way behind industrialized countries. So the workers should not be, it should not be the right moment for workers to rise up. But he wants to make it happen anyway. So he invents some new stuff. One of them is the concept of the vanguard of the proletariat. This is the idea that rather than relying on the workers to rise up because they're not ready for it yet, or relying on the serfs and former serfs in the agricultural areas to rise up because they kind of toyed with that. The Bolsheviks toyed with that a little bit in the beginning of the 20th century, and it never worked. The peasants didn't want anything to do with these city communists. They decided they'd just do it themselves. They would proclaim themselves the vanguard. Hey, you guys want a revolution, but you don't know it yet, so we're going to do it for you. Trust us. And he was very much power-focused, power-hungry, dictatorial in spirit, repressive to the bone. So Lenin comes along. Stalin gets the credit for being the monster who ruins the Soviet Union, but Lenin was moving it that way. Most of the things that we know about from Stalin were ideas that Lenin had either created and begun or at least flirted with here and there. There was one point near the end before Lenin dies where the NEP, the New Economic Policy, where he tries to make adjustments to liberalize the economy again, because it's really not working. This new country in which there's no private property, no private enterprise. He tries to create some and allow some, but that's short-lived, and it is thoroughly squashed when Lenin dies and Stalin takes power. Interestingly enough, Lenin and Stalin hated each other. Lenin, when he was dying, he knew he was dying. He did everything he could, and with his political skill, to keep Stalin from gaining power. But Stalin overcame. So when Stalin comes to power, he takes a lot of things that were sort of dictatorial that Lenin had already started, a lot of those kind of trends, and just ratchets them up, ramp them up, full bore. So more on that when we go into communism in practice. But that's what I want you to know about the theory itself, is that according to Marx, these inherent traditions in capitalism are going to lead to greater inequality between countries, poor and rich, and inside of countries, poor and rich, capitalist versus laborers, that eventually will lead to the downfall of capitalism. I will leave it there, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye-bye.